Welcome to this first video of our first section of videos for the executive assessment about the overall first section you'll encounter on the exam, the integrated reasoning section. So let's begin just by talking about the logistics that you're going to encounter when you hit this first section of your test. It's going to be 30 minutes in total. It's going to be 12 questions. You're going to have an average of 2.5 minutes per question if you just divide 30 by 12. And you're going to have a 4-minute maximum for any question that you engage with on this section of the exam. You're going to have 4 different interactive question formats. So what that means is you're going to be able to click parts of your screen and reveal additional information for graphics interpretation, multi-source reasoning, table analysis, and 2-part analysis questions on this section. You're going to have 1 to 3 questions to answer per slide regardless of the format. And you have to get each correct to get credit for the slide. So you can't get partial credit for anything. If there are 3 questions on the slide, you must get all 3 correct to get credit for that slide in your score on that section. And one of the more interesting nuances of the integrated reasoning section is there is a 4-function interface calculator that is provided within the interface. So at the top right of the screen, you'll be able to click on that calculator and actually use it to perform basic 4-function calculations. So addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. It will have some additional buttons, but you'll basically want to stick to just those 4 functions. Now, the strategies that are involved with this section. First, make sure you consciously engage with the information. It's always going to be something slightly different with the integrated reasoning, and it's going to be in some way unfamiliar. So make sure that you're not getting overwhelmed or what I like to call shock and awed by the questions. Make sure you're just in the moment and engaging with everything. And you do, however, need to make sure you don't waste time trying to understand everything for a slide or for a set of information at the outset. So there is going to be more information per question generally with the integrated reasoning than any other question type on the exam as a whole. So make sure you're not wasting time looking at things that aren't being asked about when you're engaging with these slides. You can, however, trust that the figures they give you, whether that's say a bar graph or a line graph or something of that nature, is drawn to scale, and you can use that to inform good logical estimation. So if you're looking at some bar charts, you might be able to say, well, these bars are significantly higher than other ones, and that may save you from having to calculate all of the different possibilities that are out there. But do remember to use that calculator. I cannot tell you how many times the biggest benefit I give to folks as far as tutoring goes with the integrated reasoning section is just reminding them to use that calculator. The math that is presented in the integrated reasoning section tends to be just a bit more complex and a bit more convoluted from a calculation standpoint, and that's because they believe that you should be able to do 975 divided by 15 very quickly since there's a calculator right in the interface. So definitely use that, especially for your table analysis and graphics interpretation questions, because they tend to have some relatively just clumsy math involved. And do consider skipping lengthy prompts on your first pass through half. So remember that the goal is to spend somewhere between 12 to 15 minutes on the first half of the section and leave 15 to 18 minutes for the second half of the section, aiming to make that a harder second half. So when you're working through your halves, consider just looking at something and saying, well, there's a lot of information here. I may want to skip that for now. Make sure you see every question and get the easier ones for the half first. Don't feel like you have to do the questions in the order that they're presented in the integrated reasoning. You may be doing yourself a disservice if you do. So let's go talk about the individual questions, starting with graphics interpretation. So graphics interpretation, you're going to assume that there are 3 or 4 questions of this type in every 12 question integrated reasoning section. So that means there's going to be 1 to 2 of them per half. And you're going to always have a single slide that contains a figure or a couple of figures that you need to interpret. And there's going to be 2 to 3 questions per slide, and as we said, you have to get each of those individual questions correct in order to get credit for that slide. And the question formatting here is such that oftentimes graphics interpretation answer choices are hidden, and you have to click to reveal them. And that's going to inform how we're going to actually strategize for these questions a little bit. So First, do recognize that these tend to require a little bit less time on average. There's just 1 or 2 figures, it's just one slide of information, and you should be relatively straightforward when it comes to graphics interpretation to work through the problem, provided that you understand the figure that's presented based on the information they give you. So try to stick to about a 2-minute per average on each graphic interpretation slide, and absolutely stick to a 3-minute maximum for any graphics interpretation slide. Then you want to read and interpret the figure or figures that they provide you first to understand the basics of the graphic before addressing the question task. You're going to have to understand that figure one way or another, regardless of what they're asking. And you probably want to understand all aspects of that figure. So that's like axes and variables, the format. Is it like a flow chart? Is it a line graph? Is it a scatter plot? It can be any number of different things. And you want to make sure that you allow yourself the time to understand the figure before trying to address any individual questions. You also want to proactively solve for whatever they're asking to avoid wasting time revealing those hidden answer choices. Nothing on the executive assessment is done accidentally. They hide the answer choices on these questions because they believe that you do not need to see them to get the correct answer. So instead, understand everything with the figure, and you should be able to address the questions pretty directly. And of course, do use that aforementioned calculator for clumsy or complex arithmetic, because again, they expect you to. And even if it's got weird decimals or fractions or anything that's happening here, go ahead and use that calculator to help you avoid wasting time needlessly manually calculating things that you don't have to work through in your head. So our next question type is multi-source reasoning. So there's always going to be one set of 3 questions consecutively per 12-question integrated reasoning section that is multi-source reasoning. And it's going to be 2 to 3 tabs of information for 3 consecutive slides of questions. So there's going to be a couple of different tabs. You could have different types of information. You can have a little passage. You can have a table. You can have some figures. There's a whole bunch of different pieces of information that can provide you, but you're going to have 3 straight question slides to address that information. And on those question slides, you can have anywhere between 1 to 3 questions per slide. And again, you have to get each part of the slide correct to get credit for that slide. Now, strategically, these have some pretty interesting nuances that we want to apply. First, you should allow yourself just a little bit more time per question for the multi-source reasoning as opposed to, say, a graphics interpretation. There's just much more information to synthesize. So allow yourself about 3 minutes per slide as an average for the multi-source reasoning, and a maximum of 4 minutes for any slide. But generally, you pick up speed as you work through the slides. Now, you also want to make sure that you read and identify your question task and subject first for the slides before engaging the tabs. Because if the question is asking you about something on tab 2, I don't want to waste time working through tabs 1 and 3. Make sure you know what you're being asked to do before you start working and taking notes on just the information broadly, because you'll waste time quickly. And you can consider going out of order amongst the 3 slides as well. So you might consider skipping a general question about the multi-source reasoning set of information and instead moving to one that has a more focused and specific task. So for instance, let's say the multi-source reasoning are questions 3 through 5 in the first half. Well, maybe the first question, question 3, is just which of the following can be proven true or false based on the 3 tabs of information. Well, that doesn't tell me where to go at all. But if I skip to question 4, maybe it asks me about what is the ratio that is described in tab 2. And I know exactly where to go, I know exactly what to do, and I can take notes on the tab while I'm there so that I don't necessarily have to return to it for a later question. So consider skipping any initial question slides that are too generic for the multi-source reasoning and go find something that has a specific subject and task that will allow you to engage the tabs in a more efficient manner. And of course, just like reading comprehension, you don't want to skip the multi-source reasoning questions when you encounter them, because it's fully a quarter of your entire section score as far as the multi-source reasoning goes. 3 out of 12 is 1/4 of the questions on the section. So it's too important to skip and kind of guess. So don't guess this if you're behind pace, but do recognize that whichever section the multi-source reasoning is in will affect your pacing strategy. So remember, we wanted to spend somewhere between 12 and 15 minutes on the first half because we want to get to the harder second half. But if the first half includes the multi-source reasoning, you're probably going to be closer to 15 minutes. And on that first half, if the second half it has the multi-source reasoning, you probably want to spend closer to 18 minutes. And of course, as you're working through the half on the first pass, you'll quickly determine whether the multi-source reasoning is in that half or in the other half. So use that information to help you allocate your time wisely within the section overall. Now, our third question type is a table analysis. So these are generally going to be the rarer ones. You'll have 1 to 2 per half usually, but you can actually not have any of these in a half. You're going to assume there's 2 to 3 of these in every 12 question integrated reasoning section, but they're tending to be a little bit easier, and they often will replace one of the 3 table analysis questions with either an extra graphic or an extra 2-part analysis, which we'll talk about in a moment. And your table analysis is always going to be a single slide containing a sortable table that you have to interpret the information from. You're going to have 2 to 3 questions to answer for the slide, and as always, you have to get all of the questions correct to get credit for that slide. Now, strategically, for table analysis, much like graphics interpretation, you want to spend less time on these questions on average. So under the 2.5 minutes per question based on just the allocation of the 30 minutes and 12 questions, you want to be closer to 2 minutes here. And a 3-minute maximum hard cap for any table analysis question. You still, however, want to read and interpret the table first to understand its basics before addressing the question task. Much like the graphics interpretation, you have to understand the table holistically before you can answer questions about it. So don't read the questions and then go to the table. That kind of becomes the cart pulling the horse as opposed to the horse pulling the cart, as it were. Instead, go take a moment, understand the table, and while you're doing that, consider an initial sort to fully understand what's happening with the categories and set yourself up for an organization of the information that's more useful. In many cases, you'll end up with an initial sort by default that is just alphabetization, and that's not going to be helpful at all. They're never going to ask you which of the following is the 7th alphabetically in the table. They're going to ask you about the actual numeric information or other information that's presented in the table. So consider giving yourself an initial sort to gain an initial understanding and force yourself to engage with that information again. It's so incredibly important on the integrated reasoning section to make sure that you are engaging the information proactively so that you're taking an active part in synthesizing those facts as they're presented. And of course, remember that calculator is there, again, for the clumsy and complex arithmetic. There may not be a huge difference between some of the answer choices. And again, you're not going to want to logically estimate, except to determine, I don't even have to do those calculations because they're so disparate from what we're looking for. But there can be really close answer choices. Like one answer choice could be 0.664 and another could be 0.661. And the reason that can be allowed is because you've got the calculator. So don't forget to use it for these types of questions. And our last of the 4 question types that you'll encounter on this section are the 2-part analysis. You're going to assume 3 to 4 questions are going to be 2-part analysis, 1 to 2 per half in the 12 question integrated reasoning section. And you're going to have a single slide containing a quantitative or verbal scenario to evaluate. So it's always going to be some sort of like problem solving or critical reasoning, reading comprehension situation that you have to address with a 2-part analysis. And you're always going to have 2 selections that you have to make for the slide, hence the name 2-part analysis, and you have to get each part correct to get credit for the slide as always. Now, strategically, these ones tend to take a little bit longer as well. There's just more to read, more to do, more to calculate, more to process. So allow yourself a 3-minute average for these question types, and again, a hard 4-minute maximum for any 2-part analysis slide. You, much like the multi-source reasoning, want to make sure that you read and identify the question task and the subject first before addressing the slide, because the task is going to dictate what you need to do with that information. And you want to apply your relevant problem solving or verbal tactics based on the question task and what they're giving you. So you'll quickly determine, if I've got numbers in the answer choices, I've got to do problem solving, which means I could probably logically estimate. I could probably back solve on some of these questions. I might be able to model a circumstance. And of course, I can do the technical math. And for the verbal, use your process of elimination markings. Use the X, use the check, use the squiggle, use the question mark. And that's going to be informed by you looking at the question task before you engage with the paragraph. But if you are behind pace in the integrated reasoning section in either half, either you're getting too close to 15 minutes on the first half, or you're just running out of time and not able to finish the second half, the 2-part analysis is your top line category of question to guess and skip if you're behind pace, because they tend to take a little bit of time to read all the information, synthesize the information, work through the answer choices, but they only affect the one slide of problems. So you don't have to worry about it impacting subsequent slides like the multi-source reasoning does. So instead, if you find yourself running behind on your pace, not able to get through everything in a two-part analysis, you might decide, let me just skip this for now, skip, and I'll return if I've got time at the end of whichever half I'm in, based on my pacing guidelines. So now that we've talked about all of the different question formats you'll find on the exam, let's just talk about some best practice tips for the section overall. First, remember to allow up to 2 skips on a half so that you don't let one question tank your section. Take advantage of the fact that the executive assessment allows you to skip and return to questions within a half. Remember as well that generally you need to miss at most 2 for a section, and that works for the integrated reasoning as well. So allow 2 skips in the half and make sure you're getting 2/3 of the questions right at least by not getting stuck on one problem, one set of questions on a slide that is harder than everything else for you. Don't let that one question tank your section. Do make sure, however, that you deliberately evaluate your graphics and tables initially, because these tend to have a lot of relatively cheap tricks. For instance, you might note that your x-axis is in metrics of 10 and your y-axis is in metrics of 5. You may also find figures where there's 2 axes that are vertical. Make sure you're fully understanding what's happening with your figures, and with the tables, note the different categories and the different variables that are in play. For instance, they often will ask about all items, and there may actually be an all items item, as it were, that's categorized properly, as opposed to having to do a full sum and average and work all of that extra calculation. They do like to waste your time. That's part of the evaluation for the test in the integrated reasoning. So make sure you're careful with the graphics and tables, even though those questions should take you less time on average. And do also maximize the amount of rereads you have at 1. Do not keep rereading, especially for 2-part analysis, except with multi-source reasoning. Because multi-source reasoning, you may have to go from tab to tab to kind of cross-check things. You're going to want to minimize the amount of tabbing that you do. And by working your multi-source reasoning slides out of order, you might be able to minimize that tabbing as well, because you take some notes when you're addressing the question that asks about tab 2. You're taking some extra notes about the question that asks about tab 3. And if the tab 2 question was the second question of the set and the tab 3 question was the third question of the set, you can then return to the first question of the set, which might be about the slides overall and all 3 of the tabs. So consider addressing those multi-source reasonings out of order, because you'll not waste time just reading everything comprehensively and trying to take notes about all of the different details. Now, as far as the pacing strategy, we've heard me say it over and over here. 12 to 15 minutes for the first half, 15 to 18 minutes for the second half. I'm going to hit that for every section over and over and over again, because we have to aim for that harder second section. But how do we do it? Well, generally there is kind of a dichotomy about which questions are easier and harder in the integrated reasoning. Generally, graphics interpretation and table analysis are a little bit easier. That doesn't mean I want to rush through them, and I remember that they are supposed to take a little bit less time, but I want to be deliberate in the first minute and then basically just go and coast through what the question is asking. So recognize that those are generally easier. You might want to try a little bit harder to work through them on the first pass, because they tend to be a little bit easier. But oftentimes, the harder ones are going to be the other types, the multi-source reasoning and the 2-part analysis. Now, the multi-source reasoning, you kind of have to engage with, because there are 3 slides for it, and I know that I can't just pass on all of it. I lose an entire quarter of the section. But the 2-part analysis, remember that not all of those are created equal. Some may be easier for you, some may be harder for you, and personal preference may come into play there as well, because your person who's better at verbal, you might like the more critical reasoning style, reading comprehension style 2-part analysis more than the quantitative ones. If you're a more quantitative person, you might be more aggressive attempting the 2-part analyses that involve problem solving, as opposed to the ones that involve those more verbal based activities. So these are your integrated reasoning tips. That's our integrated reasoning section overview. I encourage you to move on to our additional lessons on the individual question types next, and then go into our question bank to attempt these problems yourself to get a better understanding of how they will work when you take your official executive assessment.